Concepts have a hierarchical structure. The higher, more complex abstractions are derived from the simpler, basic ones, starting with the concepts of perceptually given concretes. This is a quote from Ayn Rand's Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, page 32. I'm Cody Leibold. This week in our book study on Objectivism, the philosophy of Ayn Rand, we are in chapter 4, and we are discussing pages 129 through 141, knowledge as hierarchical, followed by pages 142 to 151, intrinsicism and subjectivism, as the two forms of rejecting objectivity. I'll summarize the topic of hierarchy with two quotes from page 130. So we read from Peikoff, "A definite order of concept formation is necessary. We begin with those abstractions that are closest to the perceptually given and move gradually away from them." And he points out at the bottom of that page, human knowledge is not like a village of squat bungalows with every room huddling down against the Earth's surface. Rather, it is like a city of towering skyscrapers, with the uppermost story of each building resting on the lower ones, and they on the still lower, until one reaches the foundation, where the builder started. The foundation supports the whole structure by virtue of being in contact with solid ground. If you are familiar with the epistemological idea of foundationalism, this is something that is common throughout the classical approach to epistemology and philosophy, is foundationalism. I would say that the objectivist theory is a version of foundationalism, and this is to be opposed with the coherentist theory that understands knowledge as a web of mutually reinforcing abstractions, but that are not necessarily tied down to inductions or observations. So you can see that in Quine, you can see it in the Van Tillians. That would be the coherentist theory, but what we're looking at is a correspondence theory. Correspondence is the key issue for knowledge. And if you want to take that idea seriously, you need to be a foundationalist. So he's here discussing this idea that knowledge is hierarchical. You must reduce your concepts to observations. And many concepts that we use are multi-layers high as far as the layers of abstraction. And just a simple example would be a table or a chair is a first level abstraction. We could say there are tables, but this is a specific one. Since we can point to it and see it, that means that it's a first level. Whereas if it were furniture that we're talking about, that would be a second level, because you cannot simply point to a furniture. You get the idea. He uses the illustration of culture. What would you have to do to understand the concept of culture? Well, you'd have to reduce that to their products that human beings make, including their art and their language and their values. But then for each of those, you'd also have to reduce those ideas back down to things that you can observe. So he points out knowledge has a hierarchical structure, and according to the Oxford English Dictionary, hierarchy means a body of persons or things ranked in grades, orders, or classes one above another. They are ranked in order of logical dependence in the case of knowledge. So we're not talking about the order that you learned it necessarily. We're not talking about in any other order except for logical dependence. So for example, the proposition that God exists logically depends on the proposition that there are things that exist. If there were no things, then you could not have God existing or the world existing. So things existing is more logically basic. Now that does not mean that it's chronologically prior. I mean, God is the first thing chronologically to the world. So just differentiate between the chronological or the ontological order versus, in this case, what we're talking about is just the logical order. So in this reading, we're going to have a little discussion on hierarchy, and we can skip over to, this is quite a long reading this week. So let's talk about, at the top of 129, he uses this idea of culture, and he points out that involves observations of many things, including observations of concepts of consciousness. So it's a human product, culture. He writes at the bottom of that page, like every concept, culture is an integration of concretes. He says the concept cannot be reached directly from its concretes. It presupposes they have been conceptualized earlier using several stages. And that's the reason why we need to understand this concept of hierarchy, is we need to recognize that knowledge is formed in stages, and that you cannot affirm something that is like a stage 4 or stage 5 concept while denying its roots, because if you did that, you'd be stealing. He calls it conceptual grand larceny. So if we go to the bottom of page 131, an important point to highlight is the principle that concepts come in a certain hierarchical order or logical order. That does not preclude the existence of cognitive options. There's a range of options sometimes, but not all the time. If you go to page 132, he writes, a higher level item is dependent on the grasp of a series of earlier items. And so he's not being rationalistic about this, saying that every single concept can be mapped out as it must be recipe A, B, and C, and then D, E, and F. He's not saying that every concept can be mapped in a single way. But what he's saying is that there must be a way that it gets mapped. So a higher level item is dependent on the grasp of a series of earlier items. But that series is not necessarily unique in content. With the requisite overall structure within it, there may be many alternatives in detail. Just if you're trying to wrap your mind around what is being said here, if you're familiar with competitive chess, you notice how different pieces have different values. If you take the king, well, the game's over. But if you take the queen, that's worth 9. If you take the rook, it's worth 5. A bishop or a knight are each worth 3 points. In a hierarchy, that's a hierarchy. Some are clearly more valuable than others. But then on the case of some, like the bishop and the knight, they are of equal value. And so that if you were to treat knowledge analogously to that, you could say that in knowledge, there are some that are on the same level, and you could get to a higher level abstraction by going one way or by going the other. You have options. But you cannot deny that the pawn is only worth 1. And you cannot deny that the queen is worth 9, and so on. So he says that the concept of hierarchy applies to learning sequences only insofar as there is no option within them. It applies when a given cognitive step cannot be reached or understood without a certain kind of prerequisite. Now let me relate the issues of context and hierarchy. This is interesting. You would think that context and hierarchy, as we've been describing them the last couple of weeks, are two separate concepts. But here he points out that hierarchy is a specific perspective on the broader idea of context. So the contextual view of knowledge, he says, states that cognition is relational. The hierarchical view identifies a particular kind of cognitive relationship. It states not only that every non-axiomatic item has a context, but also that such context itself has an inner structure of logical dependence rising gradually from a base of first-level items. All right, a couple of points I want to make on these pages, and then we'll take questions. So in the bottom of page 132, he says, this brings us to the practical significance of the present discussion. The epistemological responsibility imposed on man by the fact that knowledge is contextual is the need of integration. The responsibility imposed by the fact that knowledge is hierarchical is the need of reduction. This is a lot of abstract terms, but the hierarchy fact is connected to the need for reduction. And the contextual way of thinking about things, that's related to the need of integration. Top of page 133, he writes, men can and do often try to move to higher levels of cognition without properly understanding the immediate material. They do so through several causes, such as impatience, anti-effort, simple error. The most common cause is intellectual dependence. Many men are content to take over the concepts and conclusions of other people without understanding the steps that led to them. And that would be, as the example that we looked at, where somebody applied the term fascism to Ayn Rand and to Hitler. They're just using that word without knowing what it means. They're just making it up. That's what the problem is. And there are many other examples of cases like that. We could talk about the case of calling all property theft. That undermines the conceptual hierarchy of the term property and theft. Or calling, like John Rawls said that nobody has earned their own brain, and he used that as an argument for why the rich should be robbed, basically. Okay, we'll pause there and we'll take some questions. Anyone have any comments or questions about this material so far?
I was going to say that quote that you just read on 133 speaks to Chad's question a second ago. because people who are completely intellectually dependent, who have taken over the concepts of other people, they might have only, you mentioned, Chad, learning through dialogue. They might have grasped the concrete words. And I remember being this way a little bit as a little kid. I was able to understand how different words related to each other and how different concepts related to each other, but I didn't have the independent grasp of what those referred to in reality. And so I think there's an example of what you're saying. Like, if you only take the dialogue or your conversations with people and you don't ground it in something real, you'll be left with these floating abstractions.
Yes, I have a really memorable example of something like that. There was a college course a friend of mine was in, and it was on globalism from the business perspective, the economic perspective. And my friend was required to make a 10-minute video essay describing what she thought about globalism. And I watched this essay and I realized she had no idea what the word globalism was referring to. She was just repeating the word over and over again in different contexts that she'd heard it, and it sounded completely plausible, but there was nothing being referred to. That can happen to anyone. That has to happen as you're in the process of learning. In fact, that's why you're in school. Like, you're in school so that you can learn how to use the words. But then, as Antisthenes said, you must reduce your words. You must learn what they refer to in reality. So he says that the investigation of the meaning of words is the beginning of education. That is what we're doing as we get educated. Go ahead, Jacob.
I was just going to say, I think a great example of that, of not having a solid reference to the word that you're using or the term you're using in Christian circles today, is the concept of imago Dei, or being created in the image of God. Almost every Christian is going to affirm that, but very few Christians are going to be able to specifically describe what they mean by that, what the reality that they are referring to when they use that term. And even among those who would be able to describe what they mean by that, it's going to be very uncommon for you to find any common answers. So among the people who can describe it, they're going to have a huge variety of conflicting views, which they aren't articulating or communicating when they're talking about that term. And so you've got everybody affirming that term, but meaning completely different things. So you have a situation where it seems like everyone agrees when actually everyone is in very staunch disagreement on a very important issue. But that all goes beneath the surface and causes a lot of problems through implication without understanding what the source of the problems are, because everyone is just sort of equivocating by using the term without specifying the reference.
We also see that pattern with the idea of total depravity, how that is applied. I've seen examples of people saying, we believe in total depravity, therefore everybody is guilty of this specific sin, or everybody is tempted by this specific sin. And you can also connect that to the idea of the noetic effects of sin. That's also a floating abstraction in many people's mind. They haven't grounded what they mean by that. They haven't defined it in the way that Jonathan Edwards has so effectively done so, which we've discussed previously. Andrew, I saw you.
Yes, I'm trying to comfort the baby as best I can. Another thing that I kind of had a question for everyone. Is Peikoff using the term epistemology in the same way as other authors do? Because I feel like I typically think of epistemology as the kind of science, or I'll come back to this. Sorry.
That's perfectly fine. Most of us have been there or want to be there. So good for you, man. I don't know what your question was going to be, but generally, yes, Peikoff is using epistemology, the normal sense of the term, the study of knowledge, of how we gain knowledge, how we decide that something is knowledge. Those are the kinds of questions, epistemology. Anyone want to comment on that? All right, let's go to the bottom of page 133. He says reduction is when somebody's means of connecting an advanced knowledge to reality by traveling backward through the hierarchical structure involved in the reverse order that is required to reach the knowledge. That's when you're doing that. So reduction would be, you already have the term, but then you ask yourself, what facts of reality gave rise to the need for this term? If you could memorize that phrase, that will help you a lot. What facts of reality gave rise to the human need for this term? So reduction is the process of identifying a logical sequence of the intermediate steps that relate a cognitive item to perceptual data. Since there are options in the details of a learning process, one need not always retrace the steps one initially happened to take. What one must retrace is the essential logical structure. Such retracing is a requirement of objectivity. And objectivity, I would say, is very lacking in theological academia. And this is the reason why, is because when we have something like the Bible that we all affirm as a correct, true statement, then people will reason from the Bible, reason from these true statements without asking, well, what facts of reality gave rise? It's almost like they've just started in midstream with statements, but they're not ever asking, well, why did God say that? Can we show that it's true? What does it mean? What is the application of that? All these type of questions, they don't have to be answered for a theologian some of the time, because the theologian can simply quote what the Bible says, and people will say, yes, I agree with that, but do we understand what it means? And for that, we would require reduction. If you ever get a flowery sermon where there's just adjective after adjective, the heavenly virtue of the gratitude of the perspicuity of the, you're like, wait a minute, I don't know what you're saying anymore. Top of page 134, he writes, reduction means asking repeatedly, what does one have to know in order to reach and understand a given step? And he gives the example of friend. You'd have to understand the idea that we have affinity, that there are people, that we make choices. There could be no idea of friendship if you didn't have the concept of making choices, and so on. He has a really great description. I won't go through it because it's all self-contained. But on the bottom of page 135, he summarizes, men have to choose among purposes by means of their values, which fact generates certain kinds of mutual estimates and emotions, including esteem and affection, which make possible a certain kind of human relationship, friendship. Now, giving some thought to that will help you be more careful conceptually when you call somebody friend, or when you decide whether somebody is worth being a friend. So there are many values in doing this kind of reduction. One is, he calls it self-protection. And at the bottom of that page, he writes, once you know the conceptual roots of friendship, the chain of antecedent concepts linking it to perceptual reality, you know the rules of its proper use, and you can recognize any egregious misuse. Any thoughts on that part before we move forward? Top of page 136. Middle of that page, actually. Rand referred to this fallacy of the stolen concept. I think this is one of the most valuable tools that I've seen in the whole epistemology that she offers, especially if you're trying to engage intellectually in a public way, is to be able to identify other people stealing concepts. The fallacy consists in using a higher level concept while denying or ignoring its hierarchical roots, one or more of the earlier concepts on which it logically depends. This is the intellectual equivalent of standing on the 40th floor of a skyscraper while dynamiting the first 39. And Peikoff explains that the reason that stolen concepts are so prevalent is that most people and most philosophers have no idea of the root of a concept. In practice, they treat every concept as a primary. It's just a given. And you can see this all the time on Reformed Twitter. Bottom of page 136, the antidote is reduction, of course. Top of page 137, certain concepts, they're called pseudo-concepts, cannot be reduced to observational data, and this is the proof that such concepts are invalid. Yeah, Jacob.
One point that's a little ironic is that the concept of a stolen concept, which Rand is identifying here, or through Peikoff, is something that I think a lot of presuppositionalists are attempting to identify when they talk about you can't justify that with your worldview or by your presuppositions. They're attempting to claim that atheists have stolen concepts. Something like morality, they're claiming, is a stolen concept on the atheist worldview. The problem is that they don't fully understand what that means and what the difference is between that and epistemological justification. And so that they end up making all kinds of confusing arguments that make it sound like you have to accept the entire worldview as a whole before you can affirm any one piece of it. So I think that it's just helpful to understand that I think we can affirm the same thing that they're affirming sometimes in saying, yes, this idea is inconsistent with the more foundational ideas in the atheist worldview, but that's not the same thing as saying that it's totally unjustified. They might have good epistemological justification and just be making an inconsistency in the application.
A happy inconsistency is a term we sometimes use. I see that there's Andrew, you're back, and you also have already wrote out your comment, but go ahead.
Yeah, and I was going to say, just maybe to summarize what Jacob just said, they also want to play the reduction game, but for them, the thing that's at the very bottom is something that's arbitrarily just put out there. They're like, hey, you can't have a stolen concept. And so it's like, okay, all right, let's reduce it down to the sensory level. I say, no. You have to reduce it down to something that you just presuppose. It's like, I'm with you until you get to the very bottom of the building and you realize you've built the 40-foot skyscraper on sand.
And then you also had this comment on epistemology. Do you want me to read that? Or you want to ask that question?
Yeah, I was going to just say, it seems like Peikoff uses the term epistemology to refer both to epistemological justification, like justifying belief in a proposition. So you've got a concept and then another concept that are being linked, like all SRP. Mm-hmm. But he also seems to use that term epistemology to refer to forming the concepts in the first place. Yes. I wondered if that was a commonplace use of that, or if that's, I've got no problem with him using that term in a different way, but I didn't know if it was a different way than other people use it.
So within various epistemological accounts, you don't always see the theory of concepts being the primary issue. In objectivism, you do. Many epistemologies, I would say all of them, are concerned with how do you justify propositions. I mean, how could you claim to be an epistemology if you're not concerned with that issue? But Rand pointed out that first, propositions require concepts. Until you know that your concepts are properly formed, how are you going to make propositions that predicate one thing of another thing? So there's a point of agreement there, and then a point of innovation. And the innovation is the specific theory of concepts, as well as assigning that level of importance that she does to the theory of concepts. Almost everything that we have said so far about concepts and how they are formed can equally be applied once we get to the issue of creating generalizations, logical inductions, propositions, predications, and so on. And there is more material from Peikoff on this issue worked out as applied to scientific induction in his book, The Logical Leap, Induction in Physics. And there are also some advanced courses within the Objectivist corpus on logical induction. And in fact, even the course, Andrew, that you've been looking at, was it called Induction, Objectivism through Induction? That one goes into more detail about induction. What we're seeing in OPAR is a presentation of the conclusions of objectivism. And so to some degree, all he's doing is giving you the what, not the how did we get there. But if you pay attention to the kind of arguments that he uses to justify his conclusions, you'll notice that although this book does not tell you a lot about induction, it is itself the best example of induction that I've ever seen in any philosophical work. This is all induction. It's just he's not talking about the method of how he got there, because you first have to get there. Only then afterward can you reflect on what was done to get there. And Greg Salmieri also has good material on this. There's several epistemology courses about this. Induction is a really interesting topic, and there's a puzzle that the objectivists know how to answer that almost no one else does about induction, and that is, if we need a method of knowledge in order to properly arrive at knowledge, then how do we arrive at our method of knowledge without begging the question? And there is an answer to that, but I'll just leave it as an open thread right now, because I think it's worth motivating you to hunt down that answer or to contemplate it yourself. But that's a little aside from what we're doing right now, because right now we're just looking at the conclusions on the first level of what objectivism is. So we are in page 137. He lists some anti-concepts or some pseudo-concepts like McCarthyism, extremism, isolationism. These are non-integratable with observations. He also lists ghosts, God, and gremlins as pseudo-concepts, and I just disagree with him. Andrew, if you wanted to discuss whether or not God is something that can be reduced, this would be a good time.
Yeah, I was kind of laughing at that just because, Peikoff actually holds Thomas Aquinas in pretty high esteem. If you listen to his History of Philosophy, he actually says that Thomas Aquinas did a better job of accounting for logic than Aristotle did. And Aquinas's whole introduction to his Summa is to show the specific observations that we see that are actually generalizations, and that you use those in a logical manner to conclude that there is a God. And what it amounts to is saying we observe certain phenomena that we abstract. To do it the opposite of reduction, just building it up, you would say I observe different things happening. I see different causes, and then you abstract from that there is a law of cause and effect. Then you observe different things about the nature of things, about where they can come from and what can give them their being and things like that. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but essentially you are using observations and making inductions from those observations, and then you look at them all coherently, i.e., you don't contradict yourself anywhere, and you realize there must be a first cause, there must be a God, and then we can say all these other things about him. And then there'll be even people like Owen Anderson who will say Aquinas didn't even, he could have been bolder in what he said that we could know about God. So that would be a hint at where you would go if you wanted to reduce that concept to the sensory level.
I would also point to, at the FT and CI YouTube channel, we have a video and we have a podcast episode called Theistic Arguments, something like that. It's a recent article. It's a recent one. It might be episode 39 or something. Go ahead, Jacob.
I think a lot of objectivists end up equivocating on this topic of reduction to sensory perception, because they clearly mean, and Peikoff clearly indicates that they mean reducing to perception in the sense of having a reason for affirming that XYZ exists, not reducing to perception in the sense of having actually observed an instance of XYZ. And he uses the example of atoms or subatomic particles or things like that, where we've got reason to believe this thing exists based on what we've perceived. And then we're inferring from what we've perceived that this sort of thing must exist. And they say that's totally legitimate with subatomic particles and things like that. But when it comes to God or the soul or anything quote unquote supernatural, they jump over to a different meaning where they start to mean, no, you have to have observed an actual instance of the thing. And so if it's invisible, like God, and non-tactile, you don't have any way of directly observing it with your senses, then it is ruled out by this rule. So that they change the standard midstream depending on what you're talking about.
Yes. All right, I'm going to move forward in the reading. This is page 138. We're talking about the idea of proof. Now, we've talked about proof here and there in previous videos, but we used the term validation as opposed to proof somewhat earlier, because if you are going to believe that there's, like in this case, there's a microphone in front of me, I don't need to prove that there's a microphone. I simply need to observe it. It's a first level indubitable thing to me. Whereas if I were going to make an argument that is something that's not first level, that's where I would need proof. So we distinguish between validating an idea versus proving an idea. And he says proof is a form of reduction. The conclusion to be proved is a higher level cognition. So we don't prove things like my name is Cody or your name is Jacob or something. We don't prove that. We would simply validate it, and there would be a way to do it. But the issue here is for higher level cognitions, you do use something called proof, whose link to reality lies in the premises. These in turn eventually lead back to the perceptual level. Proof is thus a form of retracing the hierarchical steps of the learning process. Now, if you're talking with a Van Tillian, with a presuppositionalist, they're going to ask you how you can prove that your senses are valid. And they're going to try to follow David Hume in his skeptical arguments, and then they're going to offer their presuppositional system as an alternative to the problem that they think that they have just stuck you on. But what they're doing when they're asking if you can prove that the senses are valid is inverting the hierarchy of these concepts. It's by the senses which we prove things. We'd have no need for proof on the issue of whether there's a microphone in front of my face. We would use proof only for higher level things. So that's the issue. That's the error that they're making. Peikoff writes, proof is not a process of deriving a conclusion from arbitrary premises or even from arbitrary selected true premises. Proof is the process of establishing a conclusion by identifying the proper hierarchy of premises. In proving a conclusion, one traces backward the order of logical dependence, terminating with the perceptually given. Trying to start midstream is what the Van Tillian system consists of. Whereas tracing things back down to not arbitrarily selected premises, but the observations and the question being answered, why do we need these concepts? That's objectivity. Bottom of this page, logic requires a recognition of both context and hierarchy. A logical conclusion is one which has been related without contradiction to the rest of man's conclusions, the task of integration, and which has been related step by step to perceptual data, the task of reduction. Between the two processes, man achieves a double check on his accuracy. Every conclusion must stand the test of his other knowledge and, through the necessary intermediate chain, the test of direct experience. I'll skip to the bottom of 139. Let me conclude the discussion, Peikoff writes, of hierarchy by explaining the principle of Rand's razor. And that is you have to name your primaries. You have to identify your starting points, including the concepts that you take to be irreducible. In this case, she has named her axiomatic concepts such as existence exists and consciousness and identity. Those are her axiomatic concepts. She also names her corollaries. But she says you have to identify your starting points, including the concepts that you take to be irreducible, and then establish that these are objective axioms. She says, do not begin to philosophize in midstream. Do not begin with some derivative concept or issue while ignoring its roots, however much the issue interests you. Philosophical knowledge is hierarchical. And you'll see this in ethics. Once we get to ethics, she's going to start building her understanding of ethics by asking, what is a man? And what is a value? How many ethicists at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention will tell you that you have to have a certain number of immigrants coming in per year funded by us, but they will not name their primaries. What is a value? What is the nature of man? Let's talk about the anthropology and so on. So that's a razor. It slashes off useless ideas. I would say that Russell Moore, formerly of the ERLC and the Southern Baptist Convention, and Tim Keller and many other of these people that are just so abusive intellectually, conceptually, what they're doing is they are crusading for non-integration intellectually. Top of page 140. Many people that are in the academic world today will say that system building is the cardinal sin. When I was in college, I remember I brought up to the professor at one point, have you ever thought about the fact that all the academic subjects are really just asking something about existence? And I pointed this out to him. I guess I'd read Atlas Shrugged, but I hadn't read a lot of philosophy yet. But it just occurred to me that history was the study of all the things that were real in the past, and that science is the study of how things currently in the present that we can observe work what kind of causes and effect happen. And then literature is, you could conceive of that as what could be. And, as Aristotle or Rand, somebody pointed out what should be and ought to be. That's what literature does. And I just realized that being, existing, or realness was related to all of these things. And I said, have you ever thought about maybe making a schema of understanding every subject in relationship to this aspect of being? And he says, oh, that's just system building. And it was as if, because it's system building, therefore it's useless. I was like, well, I think I had a more philosophical mind than him even at that point. And I never read Opar at that point, but I knew that there was some virtue in system building. So,
real quickly, Cody, not only are many Christians intellectuals ambivalent towards system building, like you were just referring to, a lot of them are explicitly anti-system building. In fact, John Frame's systematic theology, ironically enough, argues against any one right way to build a systematic theology. He argues against there being a central foundation to systematic theology or any one right way to build a systematic theology. The idea is there is no one right system. It's all, he doesn't say arbitrary, but that's the way he treats it if you flesh it out.
In practice, yes. We are going to have more to discuss in this reading than we can do in 1 week, I've just realized. So we'll get through just probably this section on the next couple of pages, and maybe we can get started a little bit on this intrinsicism, subjectivism topic, but it's itself probably worth more time. So at the top of 140, and in this whole section, he's describing how you could undermine the hierarchical roots of knowledge itself by positing that there's a mad scientist manipulating your brain, similar to Descartes' theory or his imagined idea. What if your beliefs are being manipulated? But they point out there are, in this construction, it's being posited that there are scientists and electrodes that may have brains. Scientists can go mad. Electrodes can affect brain function. That's all self-evident, but we're going to use that to try and argue that there are no rocks. There's something wrong there because you're inverting the conceptual hierarchy. You're stealing concepts in order to make argument denying concepts. And that's why he calls it conceptual grand larceny. Bottom of that page, it is as futile to uphold true ideas while ignoring hierarchy as to uphold false ones. Contrary to today's conservatives, for example, it is not an axiom that man has the right to property. So now we're seeing some of the payoff of epistemology. In the realm of politics, if somebody says, well, it's just an axiom that we should not initiate force or that we have right to property, Rand disagrees. It's not an axiom. The right to property is a consequence of man's right to life, which right we can establish only if we know the nature and value of man's life, which the Founding Fathers got right, I will note. All right, let's go to the middle of page 141. Miss Rand had asked someone where he started philosophically, and he replied, I start where the last generation left off. So that's the opposite of Rand's razor, naming your primaries. In this case, this is an academic philosopher in the mid-60s or so on, so probably, saying that he is going to build on Heidegger, or he's going to build on, I don't know, some Wittgenstein. He's going to build on their conclusions, but he's not going to trace their conclusions to reality first. He's not going to do the act of reduction. And because of that, you don't know if Heidegger or Wittgenstein made major errors, and before that, if those errors were based on, say, Hegel or Kant or Hume, or even errors tracing all the way back to the ancient Greeks. You don't know because you haven't thought originally. You haven't thought for yourself. You're only critiquing the critiques of the critiques of the critiques. And it becomes more and more useless over time. Bottom of page 141. This is where the advice offered by the philosopher in Atlas Shrugged, Hugh Axton, is eminently applicable. Check your premises. If you propose to enter the field of philosophy, check your premises, see what they depend on, and what that depends on, all the way back to the base of the structure. If your reduction is accurate, you will find that the base is the axiom with which we begin. Existence exists. And I pointed that out earlier. You can't have God exist without there being existence of some kind. It's logically indubitable that that is the base. We move on to the next section. This is page 142, intrinsicism and subjectivism as the two forms of rejecting objectivity. So this is a major pivot. This is not directly connected with the previous section, but Peikoff puts it at the end of this material because he's wanting to contrast the theory that he's just explained with other theories. Jacob Brunton has entered the chat. All right, and so I should just mention up front, this is more than we can discuss in the remaining time, so we'll spend maybe 15 minutes or so on it today, and then we can follow up and just do an extra session. So it's going to change our schedule of readings slightly. I'll just make sure and update it at the webpage where we have the material. So he writes, historically, the three main theories of concepts are Platonic realism, Aristotelian realism, and nominalism. So two different variants of the realist theory, and then there's nominalism, which existed in the time of the ancient Greeks, but it was fleshed out in the medieval times. So he writes, Plato held that concepts refer to otherworldly universals, to non-material forms such as madness, tablehood, goodness, which he believed are independent of consciousness and any concrete embodiments. This theory is known as realism because abstractions are viewed as external existence. They're viewed as features intrinsic in reality apart from any relation to man or his mind. And then he explains Aristotle's theory, which is also called a variant of realism, but it's pretty different. Every entity, says Aristotle, is a metaphysical compound made of two elements, form and matter, or structure and stuff. The first is the universalizing factor, the same in every instance of a group, which enables it to bring the instances together under a single concept. The second is the particularizing factor unique to each instance, which makes each thing an unrepeatable concrete. For Aristotle, universals are not otherworldly, but they are still phenomena intrinsic in reality. Universals, in this view, exist in particulars. They exist in particulars as elements independent of man. Tablehood et al. Are out there in the world as structural features of physical entities. So the tablehood is there. That's what he's saying. They are structures independent of any process of consciousness. You can contrast that to what we would hear from Salieri, one of the Objectivists, who would say, it's not appropriate to say the tablehood is out there, rather that we are conceptualizing all these objects in a universal way, not that they are universals, not reified. So that's his perspective. So then anyway, Aristotle's answer, though more plausible than Plato's, comes down to a passive receptivity or intuition. And so he has a epistemological critique there. And this is a point that Jacob mentioned, and Jacob, feel free to jump in anytime, but Jacob has said that it's important that we distinguish when he's discussing these other theories. Is he critiquing their metaphysical position or their epistemological position? Because it would be possible for somebody, and I think Jacob does this, to affirm methodologically what they're recommending without denying Aristotle's or Aquinas's view on metaphysics. So that's what Jacob is trying to maintain.
Yeah, and I think it's actually most clear on page 143 in the large paragraph middle and then the beginning of the last paragraph. The middle paragraph, he's critiquing nominalism, and his critique of nominalism is that on nominalism there is no metaphysical basis for the classifications. There is no metaphysical similarity, meaning in reality. So he's saying that that's a bad aspect of nominalism. And then when he switches to critiquing realism, he's not talking about the metaphysical view. He's talking about the epistemology of, well, on the realist view, you have to just passively discover these entities in reality rather than discovering them through the work of perception and concept formation. So his critique against nominalism seems to be an affirmation of the metaphysical view of realism. And then his critique against realism seems to be a critique against the epistemological view of most historical realists. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm following you. I think that there is a distinction that you might have missed, and that is that his position with objectivity, his objective, that's their term. They call it the objective theory of knowledge, is that the similarities, let me rewind for a second. His position is that there is a metaphysical basis for the conceptualization, not that the universal exists metaphysically, but that the things exist metaphysically, and that there is a metaphysical basis. And so that's the way they consistently use that term. They wouldn't say that the things outside of our perception of them and conception of them, that they are categories of things. They say that when we go to conceptualize, that we have a basis in those things themselves for forming the categories. So I think that part of your argument there hinged on not noticing that they're using the term objective basis.
Yeah, no, I acknowledge that they make that distinction. I think it's at the end of the, and we don't have to settle this right now. I think at the end of the day, it's a distinction without a difference. It's not a legitimate distinction. So he says, from Protagoras to Hume to Dewey and Wittgenstein, every existent in this view, talking about nominalism, is unique. There is nothing the same uniting the members of a group. There is no metaphysical basis for classification. So he's rejecting that, meaning he's affirming that there is something the same about the units or the members uniting the group. There is a metaphysical basis, which you're saying that he affirms. And then I would just say, and the implication of that is a metaphysical view of realism. And I know he wouldn't affirm that implication, but I'm still not sure why he denies that implication, or why he thinks that implication is dangerous or anything else, because he doesn't even address it. Whenever he addresses realism, he switches to the topic of epistemology. So the metaphysical view of realism, which he doesn't affirm, is never acknowledged and therefore never really engaged with.
I think that from his perspective, and I agree with it, it's allowable that he wouldn't engage with it, because he understands that the Aristotelian realism theory was created using the method that says what facts of reality give rise to the need for these concepts. And Aristotle posited that these similarities must exist in the individual things, and that the universal quality must exist in each individual thing as a means of accounting for what it is that we already know that we do when we conceptualize. And so, since the objectivists have offered a different account of what it is that we do when we conceptualize, they don't see that there's any need to engage with this other theory, because they've shown more accurately in their understanding what is going on.
Yes, I'm not blaming Peikoff for not engaging it. I'm not trying to imply that he was being dishonest or disingenuous. I agree with you, because it was so closely tied to the issue of epistemology, and because they have this uniquely valuable epistemological theory from Rand, I understand why he didn't engage with it, or why it didn't even occur to him to engage with it. I was just pointing it out to say, in our context, it is something worth engaging. If I was talking to Greg Salmieri or another objectivist scholar today and pointing out that distinction, then it would be worthwhile to engage it. And I would hope that other objectivists would engage it eventually.
I think there's a lot of value in that. I agree. Okay, so let me read in the middle of page 143. Every existent, now that he's summarizing nominalism, every existent in the view of nominalism is unique. There's nothing the same uniting the members. Now, because he's representing their view, I take it that he thinks there is something the same uniting the members. Within the objectivist way of approaching it, there are similarities. It's just that when he says there are similarities, what he means is there are objects that exist in certain ways. And so all he would say is not that the similarities exist in the same sense that objects exist, but that objects exist, and when they come to be viewed in connection with each other as opposed to a third thing, then it will be noted by anything that's capable of measuring, by any mind that's capable of measuring. It will be noted that these two are closer in extension or in color or whatever attribute than a third object. And so he sees similarity as being it is a perspective on the object. It is an idea that has objective basis, but that is not self-existing. That would be how I would try to summarize what he's saying. Middle, page 143, we do not discover classes as the nominalists claim. We create them. Now, objectivists want to come in and say, well, there is a sense in which we create them, but the sense in which we don't. So we've got the si et non type approach here. We want to make a subtle distinction here. That's what the objectivists are trying to do. So he writes, according to the realist approach, conception is to be construed along the model of perception. In perception, there is a table out there, and we need merely expose ourselves to it, letting the entity imprint itself on our senses. Now, here he's critiquing what he sees as an epistemological problem with Aristotle's realism. So, Jacob, you're right to note that is he's talking about epistemology here. So, if he disagrees, then that disagreement is only as good as the topic that we're now discussing. You cannot apply it outside of that topic. But he is criticizing their theory of concepts, no doubt. And he points out that the problem is that they think that you just glance at things and that by intuition you know that they're similar. And why would the Aristotelians, why would Aristotle himself have had that idea? Well, that's the way we experience things, is we just immediately, without having to work through any kind of recipe in our minds, we understand that two things are similar to each other. And then once we're given a word to describe them, such as tables, we say, okay, that's easy. It's just tables. And if all of our concepts were low level like that, we would never have developed an epistemology. We would have never developed a theory called Aristotelian realism or Platonic realism. The question arises when we get to issues where you cannot just by intuition know what justice is. This man did this thing. Does it deserve death or not? Can your intuition tell you that? Maybe my intuition and your intuition are different. And so that's why we have this whole subject. And unfortunately, if Aristotle didn't have a theory epistemologically of how to suss out those things, which he didn't, then you're going to get something like Aristotle's sort of common sense approach to ethics and his traditionalist approach to political theory, which was just decimated by anybody that was desiring to disprove his arguments, because he hadn't really made a full argument for those things in the way that you're going to see that Rand is able to do it in the rest of this book. So bottom of page 143, he writes, thus the traditional alternative conceptualization is passive absorption of the external, or a realm in which anything goes. Passive absorption versus anything goes. And he's talking about intrinsicism versus subjectivism. You could understand these ideas in relation to aesthetics. If you're interested in church music and you've been noticing the discussion lately going on with the G3 writer Scott Aniol, he has an intrinsicist theory of beauty, and he's attempting to combat the subjectivists by making intrinsicist arguments. Yes, Jacob writes, there's a lot to discuss on these coming pages, and I agree, we'll save that for coming weeks. Just going on, like, if you look at my page, I mean, it's like, okay. I'm one of those guys that hardly leaves anything not commented on and underlined. I'll just summarize here at the top. Objectivism is claiming that concepts are a phenomenon that includes more than only existence apart from consciousness. It is existence and facts about how consciousness must act as it grasps existence. So as we try to criticize or as we try to understand objectivism's viewpoint, I would just say that there was a realist theory, there was a nominalist theory, and objectivists want to say that the main assertions under realism are correct with qualifications, and there are points that are being made by nominalists that are also correct, which we can accept with qualifications. And what they're trying to do is affirm that when we form a concept, we are pulling reality in, but we are also pulling in facts related to how the human mind must conceptualize, and we are making use of those facts. We're employing those facts in combination with our observations. And so for that reason, it's a human product. And looking at it from another perspective, it is the objects, but it is the object as viewed as by the human method. So that's that doesn't necessarily disprove realism, but I want to be fair to what they're doing and say that this is taking ideas and trying to synthesize or form a different solution that accounts for the objections that both schools had raised against one another. Top of this page, in the one view, concepts represent phenomena of existence apart from consciousness, but in the other view, they represent phenomena of consciousness apart from existence. And they categorize those two ideas as intrinsicism and subjectivism. Intrinsicists, eager to ground human thought in the world of fact, project the products of man's conceptual activities outward into reality apart from man. And it's the apart from man that is the concern. Whereas the subjectivists, rebelling against such projection, give up the quest for grounding man's conceptual products. They typically declare being his chosen creations, his own perspective on things, are detached from reality. Neither school understands that such products by their very nature reflect both fact and choice. So consistently throughout our understanding of the concept of objectivity, we have understood that you must have the facts of reality and the facts of human choice in order for a concept to be objective. That's going to apply when we get into the ethical theory as well. When we say that something is a value and that we're being objective, that we're being correct, when we say that it is a human value, we must employ both the facts of reality and human choice. You'll see that in one of the illustrations, if you've read ahead, there's the illustration of a boy who gets told he has to become a doctor, but he doesn't really want to, and because he didn't choose it, it's not a value to him. So this idea of what objectivity is going to run throughout everything we say in this book. You must employ reality and consciousness in your conceptualizations. Otherwise, you're missing something. And that's the main criticism that objectivists are going to give against the intrinsicists and against the subjectivists. It's very easy to criticize the subjectivists. As Christians, we know that they're wrong, unless you're Tim Keller, but I would say then we know that Tim Keller's not a Christian. But when it comes to intrinsicism, this is going to be representative of the Van Tillian approach to knowledge frequently. We're going to see it a lot. I mean, I've seen it in such instances as a Van Tillian book on why all architecture must include Greek columns. Could have been taken directly from the pages of The Fountainhead, right? So Ayn Rand, when she wrote The Fountainhead, that was a punch in the face to the intrinsicists.
To be clear, it could have been taken from the mouths of the villains in The Fountainhead, in case there was any confusion on that.
Thank you. Yeah, and so it's funny because Rand became famous by being so countercultural when the culture at the time was intrinsicist, but 100 years have gone by since the youth of Ayn Rand, and now we are in a nihilist, postmodern, subjectivist society, and so many of the points that Rand makes are, you're going to say, wait a minute, you're critiquing the people that I like, because the only good guys remaining are, say, the theonomists and I would say intrinsicists, the presuppositionalists. They're only good guys relative to the terrible bad guys that we have. But in the grand scheme of things, historically, it's going to be the theonomists and the presuppositionalists that are a greater threat than people like Obama, the nihilists. That's Rand's perspective, and it's an unusual perspective, but it does give you some mental tools to analyze what's going on in the intellectual landscape. And I think that is valuable whether or not you can agree on everything that they are claiming about Aristotle, for example. So that's, I think, where we should leave off. We're past the hour, and I just want to wrap up by saying, for the New Christian Intellectual, our podcast is aiming to plunder the Egyptians. Just as Moses and the children of Israel exited Egypt with gold in hand, we are going to exit from a book like this with gold in hand. And you get to choose, depending on how much work you put into it, and depending on whether you agree or disagree on different things. You'll get to choose what you think is worth taking out of it. But I can tell you, I have a commitment over my entire life to be a person that is helping Christians understand what is gold in this book. That's how important it is to me. That's why I would create something and put my name on it that is Christian yet connected with Ayn Rand. That's career suicide. That's reputational suicide in a lot of ways. But I looked at it, I counted the cost, and I said, having a reputation in the eyes of people like that is not valuable. And so I'm going to pursue value where I find it. And I find it here. So you can go to christianintellectual.com/subscribe to get our updates, and /objectivism. You can join us in coming weeks. We're going all the way through August or even a little further. If you are wanting to make sure you're caught up on the reading, in the coming session, we're going to complete the reading that we had intended for this week. I will wrap up there. Thank you for joining, and God bless.